I think we've all felt heartbroken and helpless watching and hearing of the deaths of more than 100 and the wounding of thousands of Palestinians, including women and children, at the fence that Israel has erected around the Gaza Strip. I don't think I'm alone in knowing that I need to better understand the history and the current actions that have brought us to this place. What are the origins of the March of Return, and how does the situation in Gaza relate to the larger Palestinian-Israeli conflict? One of the great things about life at All Saints is that we have tremendous resources in our parish family. As we have many times in this space over the years, we turn this morning to our friend, Dr. Laurie Brand. Laurie is the Robert Granford Wright Professor of International Relations and Middle East Studies at USC, where she directed the Center for International Studies, served as director of the School of International Relations, and headed its Middle East Studies program from 2014 through last year. Laurie is a 4-time Fulbright Scholar to the Middle East and North Africa, as well as the recipient of Carnegie, Rockefeller, and numerous other fellowships and grants. Having conducted field work in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Kuwait, she is the author of 5 books, including Palestinians in the Arab World and Official Stories, Politics and National Narratives in Egypt and Algeria. She is a former president of the Middle East Studies Association and has chaired its Committee on Academic Freedom since 2006. Her current research interests include citizenship, migration and diaspora, national narrative construction, and the politics of academic freedom and educational reform. So you can see we are in very good hands. Please join me in welcoming our great friend, Laurie Brand, back to the forum.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's great to be back. It's great to see some old friends. Old, I include myself old in these days, but some people from years ago when I was a bit more regular in my attendance at All Saints. As I was saying to Christina, just in the lead up to beginning, I've been following developments in Gaza. Of course, I teach about the Arab-Israeli conflict in my classes, but being forced to try and pull things together to provide you with a sort of a condensed history of how we got here was both important to me to remind me of things that I had forgotten, but it was also a very painful process. This is a dreadful history, and we're at an even more dreadful present. So what I want to do is first try very quickly to run through how we got to where we are today, and then provide some greater context about just exactly what Gaza is like today, so that this March of Return can perhaps make, I don't think that it doesn't make sense, but that you can fully appreciate just what it means to the people who are participating and the others who are in Gaza. So it's important to begin by saying that for the last 12 years, there's been a blockade on Gaza. And so the socioeconomic situation has been in steady decline. This is a blockade on land, air, and sea, which is imposed by Israel following the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007, and I'll explain that going forward. It's also enforced by Egypt. So this continues to have a devastating effect regarding access to markets, people's movement to and from the Gaza Strip. The movement itself remains severely restricted. So there are also the costs, the socioeconomic, the human costs of the periodic wars against Gaza that have taken place over the last decade or so as well. When people look at the demonstrators, many times they talk about, well, these young, particularly young men that we saw near the walls, but there were also young women involved as well, that they are looking to die. They have nothing to live for. But I found a quote from a Palestinian journalist, a woman, Maryam Barghouti, and she wrote this about the March of Return demonstrations. The misconception is that we actually have a choice, that we are willfully choosing death. The truth is that the only remaining option is to silently be imprisoned, controlled, dispossessed, and attacked for being Palestinian. There is no choice but to seek life. And that's what we are all doing. This is our crime. We are the criminals that dared to wish for life. Okay, how did we get here? So now I'm going to have to take you back to the early part of the 20th century, but I promise I'll do a fast forward. What is the Gaza Strip? The Gaza Strip is a piece of land that was originally part of the Ottoman Empire, and it fell under British control as a result of World War I. At the end of World War I, as part of peace agreements, these territories of the Ottoman Empire were divided up, and the Gaza Strip, or the area of Gaza, became part of what was called the Palestine Mandate. This was a territory then that was carved out that was given to the British to administer. The idea of mandates, they were part of the League of Nations provisions for dealing with these territories that had been a part of the Ottoman Empire, and the idea was that these mandates would ultimately come to independence. But in any case, the British, with their mandate over Palestine, as well as Transjordan and Mesopotamia, had a special provision in this particular mandate for Palestine, which was to provide for the establishment of a Jewish national home. What that meant in practice was that from the early 1920s up until the late 1940s, the British oversaw a project of what amounts to settler colonialism, that is the introduction of settlers, Jewish settlers from outside of Palestine, who had various privileges in terms of arriving, establishing businesses, acquiring land, and so on, and as well as administering their own affairs. In 1947, the situation between Arabs and Jews on the ground in Palestine had become untenable. The British turned the problem over to the United Nations, and the United Nations General Assembly voted a partition plan. This was a plan which was to divide Palestine between Arabs and Jews. So there was to be a Jewish state, an Arab state, as well as an internationalized Jerusalem. If there are questions about any of this in the Q&A, this is very fast history, it's very complicated. I just want to try and simplify it for the purposes of getting to where Gaza is today, but we can talk about more of this in Q&A. This partition of Palestine ultimately then triggered a war between the newly established state of Israel and the surrounding Arab states. As a result of that war, which ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty, in 1949, the new Jewish state found itself in control of far more territory than had originally been allotted to it as a result of the partition plan. The areas of Palestine that did not come under the control of Jewish forces were two pieces. One, sort of the rump of the central highlands of what had been the Palestine Mandate, which came to be called the West Bank. The West Bank was subsequently annexed by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the population of the West Bank was given citizenship, Jordanian citizenship. What was left on the Mediterranean coast, however, was a part of what had been the Gaza district under the Palestine Mandate. So it became known as the Gaza Strip. This area was controlled by the Egyptian military at the time of the armistice, and it remained under Egyptian military administration until 1967. So the Egyptians did not provide citizenship to the Gazans. They also did not try and annex the territory. So it was in a very different situation from the West Bank. But under the Egyptian administration, there was no long-term plan for Gaza. The Arab states didn't know, and the Palestinians didn't know what was going to ultimately develop. To the extent that there was any economic policy, it was really focused on developing citrus exports to the extent that there was land left to do that. What limited industrial production there was all geared toward the Egyptian military. Then we had the June War in 1967, generally in the US known as the Six-Day War. As a result of that war, the rest of these territories that had been part of historic Palestine came under Israeli military occupation. So the Gaza Strip after June 1967 was administered by an Israeli occupation authority. And that continued until 1993. Now, the West Bank held sites that were of great meaning, great significance to Jews religiously. The Gaza Strip was not of there weren't the same sorts of sites in the Gaza Strip. So Gaza wasn't coveted for sort of historical religious reasons. Rather, Gaza served Israel as more of a buffer between it and Egypt. Okay? After 1967, the Israelis began a policy of gradual settlement construction, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. Ultimately, 21 Israeli settlements were built in the Gaza Strip that took up about 20% of the territory of Gaza. Keep in mind that Gaza is, its territory is 141 square miles. Okay, it's very small, about the size of the city of Philadelphia, apparently. Okay. It's also important to note that Gazans engaged in resistance against the Israeli occupation from shortly after the conquering of Gaza by the Israelis in 1967. That resistance was largely focused in the refugee camps in Gaza, of which there were 9. And the defense minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, was brutal in his repression of this resistance. So there were major parts of these refugee camps that were bulldozed to provide easier access to Israeli tanks and Israeli military personnel to further control these camps and Gaza in general, so that the resistance was ultimately suppressed by 1971. That didn't mean that the desire to throw off the occupation ended. It just meant that this initial period of resistance of the Israeli occupation ended at that point. So let me then fast forward, because, as I said, between 1967 and 1993, this area was occupied by Israel. There were these settlement blocks that were introduced. However, in 1993, 1994, there was this Oslo process, which ultimately produced a declaration of principles between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which was then envisaged to lead to a peace, an ultimate peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And as part of these Oslo Accords, there was a Palestinian Authority, which was to be a self-governing body for the Palestinians that was established. And much of the Gaza Strip, that is with the exception of certain military areas as well as the various Israeli settlements, the rest of Gaza came under the control of the Palestinian Authority. And in fact, Gaza City was the first provincial headquarters of the Palestinian Authority. Okay? That was the situation until 2005. In 2005, the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided that Israel should withdraw from Gaza entirely. Okay? So this is very different from the Israeli approach to the West Bank, where there continued to be the installation of new settlements, the expansion of other settlements. The decision was made that Gaza was just too much of a headache, too many people, too little land, and simply too difficult to govern given its importance. So Sharon had concluded that this occupation was no longer really in Israel's interest, and so he withdrew the military outpost. He also forced the evacuation of the settlements, which was a very controversial issue in Israel at the time. That meant uprooting about 10,000 settlers who were living in the Strip. It was hugely controversial inside of Israel, particularly on the political right. And the current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, in fact, quit the Israeli government at that time over this withdrawal. So Sharon left the control of Gaza to this Palestinian Authority. Right? The following year, 2006, in part prodded by the Bush administration at the time, the Palestinian Authority was encouraged to hold elections because there was to be a Palestinian legislative body that was part of this expanding Palestinian Authority. The Bush administration was warned by a number of people that elections at the time would probably produce a majority, or a win for the Hamas political party. Hamas is an Islamist group. It had been at the time labeled a terrorist organization by the United States and a number of European countries. But the George Bush administration pushed ahead. Elections were held, and in fact, Hamas did win. It was a slight majority, but it did win. That then launches a new phase, and I think the phase that's most important for understanding exactly where Gaza is today. Because with Hamas's coming to power, the fact that Hamas did not recognize Israel, unlike the Fatah, the other Palestinian party, which did and which had been running the Palestinian Authority up to that point, this created a dilemma for the United States, for the European Union, for countries that had been providing various forms of aid to the Palestinians, since they considered Hamas a terrorist organization. So the United States and the European Union suspended their aid. Israel ended tax transfers. The Israelis have been collecting taxes from the Palestinians and then have been turning over some of this money to the Palestinian Authority for its operations. They stopped doing that because Hamas was in power. And there were some initial confrontations between Israel and Hamas forces in Gaza in 2006. More serious clashes broke out in September of 2006, and there were attempts then there were clashes also between these two Palestinian parties. There was an attempt by Fatah to try and sort of strong arm itself back into a position of authority in the Palestinian Authority. The rest of the history of the next several years is a very complicated story of these clashes between Fatah and Hamas and the efforts of external forces, the Israelis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, as well as the Americans, in trying to support Fatah against Hamas. What's important to remember is that, at least with regard to the Gaza Strip, by 2007, the Hamas forces had successfully defeated the Fatah forces, and so they became the governing authority. They controlled what existed of the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. Now, during this period, we begin to then see periodic Israeli, you can call them incursions, the worst ones you can call wars, which are intended to try and tame Hamas, trying to help perhaps throw it out of power, to get it out of power and bring Fatah back to power. So we had in 2006 Operation Summer Rains, in 2007 Operation Autumn Clouds, in 2008 Operation Hot Winter. We then have much larger confrontations in 2008 called Operation Cast Lead, and in 2014 Operation Protective Edge. These various Israeli attacks are referred to sort of widely in the press. This isn't some obscure citation. They refer to these actions as mowing the lawn or cutting the grass. The idea being that Hamas periodically, because of its control, because of its lack of willingness to recognize Israel, and its continued resistance, that it needs to be sort of put in its place, and the population needs to be reminded of that. So you had these periodic incursions, as well as two dreadful wars, 2008 and 2014. Let me just go through some of the statistics related to the impact of those two operations. Operation Cast Lead in 2008 lasted just under a month, began the end of December of 2008 and went into the middle of January of 2009. A total of somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 Palestinians were killed, 13 Israelis were killed. The conflict damaged or destroyed tens of thousands of homes, 15 of Gaza's 27 hospitals, 43 of its 110 primary care healthcare facilities, 800 water wells, 186 greenhouses, 50,000 people were left homeless, 400 to 500,000 were left without running water, 1 million were left without electricity, and there were also acute food shortages. During this period, the blockade continued to be in place. It continued to tighten. And this meant that it was increasingly difficult for Gazans to have access to the things that they needed, one, to rebuild after these Israeli incursions. The Israelis argued that allowing things like concrete and other sorts of things into Gaza would allow Hamas to refortify itself and to build additional rockets and mortars and so on, which Hamas periodically was shelling, by which Hamas was shelling Israel. But there was a problem in that not enough food was reaching Gaza, and there was a document that was actually, the Israeli government was forced to release in 2012, which made clear that the Israeli military was actually calculating calorie counts, trying to determine how much food it should allow into Gaza. And so it was based on 2,300 calories per day. That also took into account, apparently, the food that they calculated Palestinians themselves were producing with what land there is in Gaza. So this was called putting Palestinians on a diet, but not going so far as to make them die of hunger. In fact, the number of food trucks was estimated to be needed to get into Gaza. The amount of food that the population required was something like 170 a day, but that number rarely entered. It was usually more like about 67 trucks a day. Now, there were periodic attempts to try and break the siege. You may remember there was a Turkish ship, the Mavi Marmara, and the Israelis actually boarded that in the Mediterranean, and a number of people were killed, including, I think, a young Turkish American. There were other attempts to try and break the siege by sea, flotillas of various sorts. The bottom line is these were all to no avail. There was no let up in the blockade, the siege of Gaza, until briefly from the Egyptian side, following the Egyptian revolution in 2011. The ouster of Mubarak, led to a change in Egyptian policy, and there was an easing of the entry and exit restrictions on Gazans. That continued until Mohamed Morsi was overthrown, was removed by coup by Abdel Fattah Sisi, who's currently the president of Egypt, at which point the siege from the Egyptian side was reimposed sort of with a vengeance, because the Sisi government saw the Muslim Brotherhood as its primary opponent. They'd labeled it a terrorist organization, and Hamas, which was the Palestinian extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, was of course still running Gaza, and so the Egyptians saw them as a threat as well. The next major assault came in 2014. This was Operation Protective Edge. It began officially on the 8th of July with airstrikes. About 9 days later, there then began ground incursions into Gaza. The casualty lists or numbers indicate that between 2,100 and 2,300 Gazans were killed, between 10,600 and 10,800 were wounded, including over 3,300 children, of whom over 1,000 were left permanently disabled. 66 Israeli soldiers, 5 Israeli civilians, including 1 child and 1 Thai civilian, were killed. 469 Israeli soldiers and 261 Israeli civilians were injured. It was estimated by the United Nations that more than 7,000 homes for 10,000 families were completely razed, R-A-Z-E-D, together with 89,000 homes damaged, of which roughly 10,000 were severely affected by the bombing. Rebuilding costs at that point were estimated to run somewhere between $4 to $6 billion. So you can the impact is just was staggering. Let me turn. So now that gives you sort of the history of the military encounters. Let me say a little bit more about the blockade, about the siege, because this is a form of waging economic warfare on people's lives. Keep in mind, this siege restricts all border crossings in the territory it controls, and that is all land entries into Gaza. You have only, if you take a look, you can see the maps. I haven't been referring to the handouts, but they should be somewhat helpful. So entry by territory, any entry by sea. There is a limit on the areas in which Palestinians can even use the Palestinian fishermen have been increasingly restricted in the part of the Mediterranean that they're allowed to access. And one of the problems is that because of the overcrowding and because of the lack of access to materials to continue to keep up the sort of the health and sewage infrastructure, a lot of Gaza's sewage just goes directly into the sea, which means that the areas that the Gazans are allowed to fish from are extremely polluted. So the Israelis have also controlled access to food, which I mentioned before, to water, electricity, gas, construction materials, and so on. So it's not that Israel doesn't allow any of these things into Gaza, but it bans many products and that it tightly regulates others. And sometimes there's a logic to these things, and other times the logic is something which would escape us. The stated goal of the blockade, of course, is to prevent Hamas from staying in power. It is to try and inflict as much pain on the population as possible in the expectation that they will somehow or other rise up against Hamas and force them from power. I mean, this is the same sort of logic that was used, logic in quotations, that was used by the United States in the sanctions that were placed on Iraq during the 1990s, which resulted in tremendous human suffering. That's a topic for another forum at some other time. So according to Oxfam, the blockade has devastated Gaza's economy, left most people unable to leave Gaza, restricted people from essential services such as healthcare and education, and cut Palestinians off from each other. Let me sort of sum up with a few statistics the situation today, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. All right, so Gaza today. There is a population of somewhere around 2 million people living in Gaza. Again, keep in mind, 141 square miles. One of the highest population densities in the world. Of that 1.9 to 2 million people, 1.3 million are registered refugees. There are 8 refugee camps. 80% of the population is now dependent on international assistance. And of course, one of the reasons that the percentage is that high is that these repeated military assaults in the context of the siege, the only sort of relief from which was the tunnels that Hamas built, in part, yes, to bring in materials so they could build these mortars and so on, but also to bring in things to help Gazans have enough to eat and to bring in other sorts of materials that were necessary. I mean, you may have seen pictures of tunnels, people smuggled in car parts so that cars could then be reassembled once they got them through the tunnels. I've seen pictures of animals, sheep, goats, cows being brought through these tunnels as well. So these were lifelines for Gaza. And during these military operations, the Israelis often sought to bomb these tunnels to close them down. They got help on the Egyptian side as well, because the Egyptians then also, on a number of occasions, flooded tunnels where they could, because if you're burrowing under the ground from Gaza into what is effectively the Sinai Peninsula. So the Egyptians were then also able to do damage to the tunnels from their side. So the economy has been devastated. The capacity to create jobs has been devastated as well, resulting in impoverishment. De-development is a word which is used by, there are 2 I should mention so I don't forget. If you want to read more about Gaza after this, I would recommend you read the work of 2 scholars. They both, interestingly, are children of Holocaust survivors. And I think they both, for that reason, felt compelled to bear witness in this way, and they've done it in a tremendous way. I have one book here. The one scholar is named Norman Finkelstein. He's been very controversial, but I assure you the work that he does, it's meticulous historical research and writing, so I would recommend to you his most recent book on Gaza. There's also a woman who is at Harvard by the name of Sarah Roy. She's done work primarily on what is called the de-development of Gaza, so specifically looking at the mechanisms and the outcome of this lack of economic development in the Gaza Strip. So the de-development of a highly skilled and well-educated society is what happened in Gaza. We have average unemployment well over 41%, again, one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. More than half the population is under the age of 18. 1 out of every 5 school children is iodine deficient. 3 out of 4 youngsters can't pursue higher education in Gaza because there simply isn't the capacity. There are also many cases of young people in Gaza who have won fellowships to study outside and have been prevented from leaving, simply not allowed to go out. About 1.1 million of the Palestinian refugees living in Gaza receive food, health, or educational aid or support through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which is responsible for those services in Gaza. And about 61% of Gaza's population is food insecure. Okay, and keep in mind that a large portion of that is children. 90 to 95% of the water produced by the only aquifer in Gaza is unfit for drinking. 28% of the children surveyed in Gaza have witnessed the demolition of a friend's home, and 19% had witnessed the demolition of their own homes. So you begin to think also, and then just think about the additional, the trauma of these successive assaults on Gaza, and the symptoms that are manifested by children, various nightmares, eating disorders, and so on. Intense fear is dreadful. So let me end with a quote by Robert Piper, who was the UN coordinator for humanitarian aid and development activities in Gaza. He said of Gaza, particularly after the 2014 war, that it had effectively eliminated what was left of the middle class, sending almost all of the population into destitution and dependence on international humanitarian aid. He said, "I see this as an extraordinarily inhuman and unjust process of strangling gradually 2 million civilians in Gaza that pose a threat to nobody." Thank you.
On these incursions that you've been discussing, it's my understanding that a lot of those incursions have been responses to what Hamas has been doing, shelling and all of that. And you hadn't mentioned that at all. To what extent does that, if not justify, help explain a little bit the Israeli response?
Yeah, there's a when one talks about sort of Hamas actions and then Israeli response, and that's generally the way that it's portrayed in the press. But there are, first of all, there are numerous cases. In fact, in the case of the 2008 major assault by the Israelis, there had been a ceasefire between the Israelis and Hamas beginning in July of 2008, and it was in fact the Israelis who initially broke that ceasefire in November of 2008. But I think it's important, instead of thinking of this as usually sort of, so the Palestinians shoot these mortars, and I'm not trying to diminish the fact that this is something which has terrified the population of the Israeli population living very close to the Gaza Strip. But one has to keep in mind the larger structural violence that is ongoing, that is Israel remains, in terms of international law, it's viewed still as an occupying power, even though its forces are no longer in Gaza proper, simply because it controls all access to, or virtually all access to Gaza. So the Israelis remain responsible, and the fact that they have had this siege on Gaza, which is a form of collective punishment, which is, again, contrary to international law, this is a form of structural violence, which is ongoing. This is a daily thing. So it isn't the same thing as we don't tend to see it in the same way as somebody shooting a shell or firing a mortar. But the underlying conditions for pushing for militating for some sort of response, some sort of what Palestinians in many cases would see as self-defense, trying to bring the situation to the attention, to get more attention from the international media, from I don't believe in the international community as a term, but anyway, from outside actors. I think that's the way that it needs to be seen, so that if you say, yes, okay, the Hamas fired these rockets, yes, but they're in a situation where they're unable to rebuild their homes, where schools have been destroyed, where they're not getting enough food. I mean, that's also a form of violence, and I think it's not the same violence, but I think we need to keep that put those in context. Am I supposed to call on people, or are they just okay?
When they have a
when they have a mic, okay.
So I'm trying to understand about Egypt is Sunni Muslim, right?
Overwhelmingly, yeah. I mean, there's about somewhere between 5 and 10% Christian population, and there's a very small Shiite population.
But basically,
yeah,
they're brethren, like Protestants are Protestants, and
to the extent that serves basis for brotherliness or sisterliness, yeah.
Okay, so they should have like an affinity for Gaza, right? And aren't the Muslims in Gaza also Sunni? And there's like two types, like Protestants and Catholics or something, two kinds of Christians, and Sunni and Shia, and Iran is Shia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you said that Israel controls all access to Gaza,
except for the Egyptian entry point.
Yeah, and that's quite a border, isn't it? And so why isn't there a major? Why is Egypt also blockading Gaza, and I understand that they have been viciously bombing those tunnels, and so they are creating siege on people that should, on a government that should be of affinity with them. I don't understand what's going on, and so.
Okay, let's let Laurie respond to that.
Okay, and,
Okay.
so, and where is Hamas getting its weapons?
Okay. All right. So I tried to cover an awful lot very quickly, so let me go back and try to make this a bit clearer. What you said is true in terms of religious practice, that Egypt is overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, and so are the people of Gaza. But the most, okay, so there are two issues here. One is that following the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, and increasingly then, that was under Sadat, he was assassinated shortly thereafter, then Hosni Mubarak was president of Egypt for something like 30 years. Increasingly under Mubarak, Egypt became more of an enforcer, sort of an adjunct enforcer for whatever the United States wanted to see done in terms of regional security, and that meant controlling whatever the Palestinians were doing, so that the relations were problematic between Egypt and Gaza. But what becomes the thing that really brings this to a head, and which leads to the really serious participation of Egypt in this blockade, is the fact that Hamas is the Palestinian extension branch, if you will, of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood historically has been the only religio-political organization, opposition organization in Egypt of any significance. So when the Mubarak government, sees Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood-oriented group coming to power in Gaza, this then is a problem. They see this as a problem for them because they see the Muslim Brotherhood as an oppositional group domestically. Okay, the fact that everybody's a Sunni Muslim. I think we need to. There are times when one's confessional affiliation can be relevant, but I think in this particular case there are lots of other issues which well supersede that, and so the fact that people ascribe to the same type of Islam is just not salient in this particular case. So you have Egypt, which even under Mubarak, saw the Muslim Brotherhood as a potentially problematic oppositional group. Then when you had this relatively brief period, about 2 years after Mubarak was overthrown, and you had a new government, a transitional government, and then you had the election of Mohammed Morsi, who was himself a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian side of it wasn't a siege so much at that point. It wasn't easy for Palestinians to get in and out, but they still could. That was significantly loosened. So movement back and forth became much easier for Palestinians for that that one brief shining moment. And then after Morsi was disappeared and removed from the presidency in July of 2013, and you then had Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, military man who is running things behind the scenes, then is ultimately elected president in 2014. Following Morsi's removal, the Muslim Brotherhood is basically, they are in the Egyptian press, by the Egyptian state, they are turned into non-Egyptians. These people, we don't know who these people are, we don't worship the same God, these people are terrorists, they have to be eliminated. And that's exactly what they did inside of Egypt, and then the reflection of that policy vis-a-vis Gaza, because Hamas was still in power in Gaza, was to crack down even further. So now they've got a real shared interest with the Israelis in terms of trying to box Hamas in and trying to force Hamas out of power. So that's that. In terms of Hamas's weaponry, some of the stuff, a lot of what they have is smuggled in through the tunnels, or the materials for making it are smuggled in through the tunnels. These are relatively, these are low-level technology kinds of things. There's not any, we're not talking about any high-level technology here. There are claims that there's been some Iranian support, but again, everything would have to come in through the tunnels.
Laurie, over there. My question has to do with religious organizations, actions, and positions vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip, both Jewish and you talked about the Muslim sides, but there may be more activities going on. I just wonder who's playing what role, what between Christian organizations, between Jewish organizations, Muslim organizations, who's addressing issues in the Gaza Strip?
It's actually not an area I'm terribly specialized in. What I can say is that because of the way that Islamic organizations, many Islamic organizations have come to be viewed by the United States, and the fact that some people were prosecuted for providing aid to Gaza and through an organization called the Holy Land Fund, I believe it was, there's been a real concern among a lot of Muslims who would have otherwise wanted to send aid to Gaza, but worried about possible prosecution by the United States. So that's a real deterrent, I think, for many Muslims who otherwise, I think, would, certainly this is the month of Ramadan. This is a month also where when people, provide their zakat for the year and provide special charity givings, and it's an understandable concern. I mean, if you have to worry about whether the U.S. government is going to go after you for trying to provide aid to people in Gaza, then that's a worry. I think maybe some of my colleagues here who are more involved in All Saints would know what sort of activities the Episcopal Church engages in and other kind of mainline Protestant churches, and perhaps Randy can say something, speak to that. For
one thing I would say is we do have, the Episcopal Church does have a hospital in Gaza City, the Ahli Hospital, and it is a small hospital compared to Al-Shifa and some of the others, Al-Aqsa. But if you want to find out ways to support that work, you can do so through the American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. I'll try and make this very brief. I was in, my name is John Armstrong. I was in Egypt just after Sadat was assassinated, and then a year later, and the cessation of spending on the military and flowing into the public sector was amazing in its presence. So it's clear what Egypt got out of not being at war with Israel. Fast forward to what you said about Sharon deciding that it was no longer in Israel's interest to control Gaza, pulling out and stripping. And then this whole thing evolves again. So my question is, there's a cost and benefit to everything. What's the payoff to the international community to continue this conflict? Because I think it could have been stopped a long time ago, but I don't see any real evidence that the international community has any interest in stopping this conflict.
I mean, I think one would have to look at some individual countries, because I think there are some countries that have been more forthcoming in terms of providing aid or trying to provide some sort of assistance. But no, I think Gaza is not on it's not on the front burner for a lot of these countries. It really is people who are concerned with humanitarian issues, or countries that are concerned with having a profile of humanitarianism. I think some of the Nordic countries in particular. But when you come to, you just look what the current administration is doing, excuse me? I think it's more, well, I think it's more what is the cost to trying to stop it, which is probably the way that people would look at it. Right, but one can... Well, a payoff maybe in terms of the kind, if you think about just the U.S. position currently, the fact that there's been a significant rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that we have at least the discourse or the vision of this particular administration is that Iran is what we really need to be focusing on, and therefore if we focus on Gaza, we waste political capital, and instead we should be putting that into trying to, cheerlead for a war against Iran or something like that. Gaza is just not, it's an annoyance, I'm sorry to say, for a lot of the international community. The concern with this human suffering is worse than secondary or tertiary. One more? Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I really want to thank you for this informative overview of what is happening in Gaza. And I want to thank everybody in the audience who are interested in knowing the truth and hearing of the facts. As a Palestinian born in Gaza, allow me to give a couple of comments, and I would like to hear from you. One thing you didn't touch on regarding the blockade in Gaza is what it's making, how it's impacting people's lives. I'll just give you an example. My cousin's husband, who is in Gaza, died right before Ramadan. His daughter, who is studying in Egypt, was not even allowed to come and attend his funeral. This is what the blockade in Gaza is doing to the family. I am Palestinian, I'm from Gaza, and neither Israel nor Egypt allow me to go to my homeland and the place I was born. It separates Palestinians in the West Bank from Gaza. It separates families. With that said, I want to touch a little bit on Hamas. Yes, Hamas is seen as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, but Hamas was not created by the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas was created by none but Saudi Arabia. And they created it to oppose the Palestinian Authority. Again, for the intention of creating division within the Palestinians. Divide and conquer, it's a common practice. And Saudi Arabia all along was in court with the US to create that division. The only reason why, sure, just a quick one. Hamas in 2017 acknowledged the state of Israel and acknowledged it on the borders of 1967. Did any of you hear about that?
I'm sorry,
Because the media did not want to.
I have to stop this because we have to go to church in 10
So-
minutes. And can you stick around for a few minutes?
Yeah, if I could just say one
Laurie's
very.
going to stick around, and I invite you to come up and continue the conversation and ask her questions, but we just have to get to church, please. Thank Laurie Grant.